There were all those lives in there that were conceived along with me, and I was just lucky. I've had such a wonderful life, and they didn't even get a shot.
So many people walk through those doors and they have no idea what happens in an IVF clinic.
It's eugenics, it is. Once we start commodifying children at any stage in their life, it is a rabbit hole.
Thank you all so much for joining to share your stories and have this really important conversation. I really appreciate it. Chelsea, we'll start with you. Can you share your story and your involvement with IVF?
Absolutely. So I am a blind wife, mother, pro-life advocate, but what I've known since I was very young is that I was a product of in vitro fertilization. I was conceived in a petri dish in the 90s because my mom was having some very serious fertility issues. She didn't know another way to deal with it. The doctor didn't really give her another way to deal with it. I was one of 4 rounds of IVF. I was their first child for my parents to make it all the way to birth. I got very lucky. I have 2 other siblings who also made it to birth, but I have several, I don't even know how many, siblings who either failed to implant or miscarried during the pregnancy, and even some who were intentionally discarded or destroyed in the laboratory. So I feel very pulled to speak about these issues, to be an advocate for not just my siblings, the ones who weren't even given a chance, but the other babies that I feel like have been forgotten or left behind in these clinics. And I just feel like that may be the reason that I was chosen by God to survive, is because he knew that I would talk about it. So that's part of what I do as a pro-life advocate and with my platform.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. Tyler, what's your story?
My parents opted for IVF in 2000, 2001. It was very hard on my mom. She could not get pregnant for years and years and years. They tried, and sorry, I'm already getting emotional. They wanted babies so bad. And they worked so hard to save up the money because they just had that desire to be parents, which I think is wonderful. I think it's a wonderful desire. And unfortunately, obviously my mom was not educated on, truthfully, on what happens in IVF. And so she went through the rounds. I was, luckily by the grace of God, I was one of the embryos that was picked. Me and another one. I was the only one that implanted successfully. The other one miscarried. At first they were told that both of us miscarried. She went in to be cleaned out, and they found that I was still there. Unfortunately, it was so hard on her body that after that she couldn't do it again. So I have lost probably around 12 siblings. They were discarded. And yeah, it's always been a fact of mine growing up, was just that I was IVF, but I was never educated on it, and it wasn't, really anything of huge importance to my family to talk about growing up. And so it wasn't until I became a mom myself and I held that life in my arms that I realized those were babies, and those were lives that were lost. So that's why I'm here today. Sorry, I'm so emotional, but yeah, I just feel like I was, my life is definitely important, but so were theirs, and I need to stand up for that.
Thank you, Tyler.
Mm-hmm.
So I was born on a farm, very interested in working with animals, and assisted reproductive technology is very common in animals. So I pursued an animal science degree and then a PhD in physiology of reproduction. We did assisted reproductive technology in all species of animals and used it for endangered species. But then I pursued a postdoctoral fellowship to adapt all that knowledge to human IVF. So I spent 2 years in a human IVF program. And then I went on to direct in an in vitro fertilization laboratory. I was the main embryologist, and I practiced for 7 years.
Do you have any sense of how many embryos you helped create during that time?
Yeah, so on average about 100 cycles a year. Each one of those on average is 9 eggs. Not all of them fertilized, but if you do the math, it comes to about 5,000 embryos.
And so the irony in some ways is that I always knew I wanted to be a doctor, but I wanted to be a pediatrician for most of my life. And up until medical school and even through medical school, but then, working on the wards and doing the rotation as well as all the other ones made me realize that I was just very drawn to OBGYN and walking alongside women in all of the stages of their lives. And in particular, I really felt an affinity towards those couples who were suffering, like your parents were, with the heartbreak of infertility or of losing their pregnancies. And so that was a lot of the reason why I chose to do a fellowship after my OBGYN residency. And in part of that fellowship, it was reproductive endocrinology and infertility. And as such, I learned all the practices of infertility treatments, but a large part of that was in vitro fertilization. And so after my fellowship, I did practice as well for 7 years. And then I tell people my proudest professional achievement is leaving everything behind and starting something new with my career, my medical profession.
Were you practicing creating embryos via IVF? And if so, how long did you do that? And do you know how many embryos roughly you would have created during your time as a doctor, an IVF doctor?
So similar to Craig, actually, since we both practiced during that time, I would do roughly about 100 cycles a year, which is also a very cold way to think about it, right? We start talking about the way that we just put these words as opposed to treating these couples and dealing with these embryos who are humans. But regardless, it roughly ends up being certainly thousands of embryos, absolutely. And I did it for a year less because I had the realization of what I was doing in terms of IVF, and I stopped that, but then had to change my path.
Chelsea and Tyler, I'd love to hear about what it was like when you first learned you were conceived via IVF and your feelings about it once you discovered that. Let me start with you, Chelsea.
My parents did me a really big favor. They never lied to me about IVF. They were very honest with me. I think before I even fully understood how babies were made, I knew that I was conceived through IVF. And at first, I was actually very interested in that. I have like a little bit of a science interest. I find it fascinating. So that actually led me to knowing a lot more about human reproduction than your average 10-year-old would, and really launched me into pro-life research by the age of 12 because I had already green-lighted those topics in my mind, being comfortable talking about IVF, being comfortable reading about it. And when I was 12, that's when I started to see issues and moral concerns, and it just made me more passionate about the subject matter. I saw horrible things that were happening and didn't understand why no one else wanted to talk about it with me at dinner. As a kid, it wasn't weird to me. And I know that I think my brother had more issues with it. He just felt kind of uncomfortable with the topic, wasn't really okay with talking about it at school. I know that some kids can get bullied or harassed, and because there's this kind of science experiment that can be labeled with an IVF child, and I just never felt that. It was probably growing up in a Christian household and always being very strong and knowing that like God created me. So just the way I always felt about it was like my body might have been made in the laboratory, but my life was created by God, and I never felt ashamed of where I came from, but I did feel very pulled emotionally by like, okay, but where's the rest of us? What happened? And so I'm very grateful that my parents didn't keep it a secret from me because I was able to research these things honestly, and it really shaped the rest of my life as I would become a pro-life advocate.
My story is somewhat similar. My parents never hid the fact that we were, I was IVF. It was just, a little fun fact. In fact, like I would bring up when we were playing Two Truths and a Lie, I would say, oh, I was created in a lab, I was created in a petri dish, because I just didn't understand. And in fact, I used to tell people growing up that, oh, I'm actually twin, but the other one passed away. And my mom would always correct me, and she would say, no, and again, not because she was trying to deceive me. It's just that's what she was told, that's what she believed. She would say it wasn't alive. Only you were alive, right? Like the other ones that we had, they weren't alive. It's like a rock, Tyler. So you implanted, you became a baby, but this other one, it didn't make it. And so it just kind of became a rock. It wasn't until I had my own baby and I went through pregnancy and I learned about all the stages that I just, there was like this part of me, like this calling or something that just like brought me to this realization of just how like invaluable life is, invaluable, so like unbelievably precious. And that's when I got into the pro-life movement. And then I found out that there was opposition to IVF at all. Why is there opposition to IVF? I look into that. I realize, it's not just they're taking out these eggs and then they fertilize 2 and then they put those 2 in there and they hope that they take. They fertilize all of them and they don't give them a chance. And that means that there were all those lives in there that were conceived along with me. And I was just lucky. Those are lives that will never get to experience what I've gotten to experience. I've gotten to experience a husband that loves me. I've got to experience children. And I've had such a wonderful life and they didn't even get a shot. And that's where I draw the line. That's where I've got to stand up. So that's why I'm here.
Do you know how many siblings you had?
I don't. It was along the lines of 15 to 20. And like I said, they only did 1 transfer, and the other ones were discarded.
It's very interesting because in residency, we're taught that pregnancy starts at implantation, right? Which means that once the embryo implants into the inner uterine wall, the endometrium, that's really when everything begins, right? And so it's just this accepted fact, that's it.
Right.
And I remember still the day and the moment I realized that I was completely blinded to the fact that that's not true. And I actually scientifically knew that because I could recite how the process of egg and sperm combined in the outer portion of the fallopian tube and then continued to divide and grow into different organs throughout that 4 or 5 day journey through the fallopian tube and into the uterine cavity. And so, of course, if that embryo is growing and dividing and has a unique set of chromosomes and is utterly irreplaceable, as you said, Chelsea, obviously that is not the moment when life begins 5 or 6 days later. But I will tell you, I spent a long time completely blinded to that fact. It's actually looking out of it, looking back at it, it's shocking that it's so clear, and it's very unmooring in some ways to realize that what I held to be true.
It wasn't?
Not only was it not, I would,
Yeah.
it just wasn't even a consideration to me.
Do you feel like then that when you were doing IVF, it was something of a cognitive dissonance because you didn't want to see? Or was it something that you just realized later on?
All I was focused on was trying to help that couple have their desire, their dream of a live-born baby, right? And I was just so focused on it. And I'll be frank with you, and even preparing for this or kind of reflecting upon this and meeting you, the unfortunate reality of it is that there's really no consideration for the children.
No. Yeah.
And I don't mean that in a harsh way, because obviously the parents so badly want that child.
Right.
But it's so inverted and distorted because our ability to see when life begins has begun completely obfuscated. And I think there's lots of reasons for that. But
Yeah,
yes.
it's definitely become more of an opinionated thing, I think, where people have their own opinions on when they want to believe life begins, and we've thrown out the science and thrown out fact, right? We don't want to believe there's fact anymore. Anyway, so yes, I totally agree.
I think most embryologists realize that life begins when that sperm binds to the plasma membrane of the egg. They just ignore that fact. The only reason IVF is successful is because you create excess so that you increase the odds of pregnancy.
What happens with the extra embryos?
It's ultimately the patient's decision. The choices would be to have them cryopreserved for later use, to essentially freeze them, put them in suspended animation, if you will, put them in liquid nitrogen and store them. At that temperature, we believe that they can stay there indefinitely. I think the oldest cryopreserved embryo was recently born, and it was 30 some years. It was in cryopreservation. The other dispositions are to simply discard them or donate them to science, i.e. research, destructive research.
I've always wanted to ask that. What exactly, because they offered that to my mom. They said that you can discard them, you can, or you can donate them to science. What experiments are they doing on these embryos? And like, how far along do they let them grow while they're doing, you know what I mean? What's happening to them?
Yeah, it's actually a good question, because unlike a person that you have to have an institutional review board approve, all right, and you have to consent, and these unborn children don't get that. It could be as simple as an embryologist that's learning needs to practice doing biopsies or something like that. To, say, experiments in how to culture embryos. So put some embryos in one culture and put other embryos in another culture and see how well they do. Today, the big thing is artificial intelligence and automation. They have pods they've created that have, think of car manufacturing. They have a robot that does all the techniques on the embryos, all self-contained. That's all research. Those embryos aren't ever going to be transferred.
So it's a toy for the robot to play with? That's what you mean when you... I guess I don't understand.
Yeah, so they're experimenting with the use of robots to create embryos and to culture embryos and to do all the procedures that an embryologist would typically do. But then those embryos are never destined to be transferred to become
Right,
human.
so not for the benefit of the embryos, for the benefit of efficiency in the laboratory and training the robots.
Correct, yes.
But to your point, Chelsea, I mean, the ultimate end goal, unfortunately, is the destruction of that embryo.
Yeah, so whether you donate them or not, they're going to be destroyed. Okay.
So my parents opted to have the embryos destroyed. The options they were given is you can donate them to the laboratory, which meant they could go to another couple, you'll never know, or they could be experimented on, you'll never know. And then the second option was they could just be destroyed. What does that mean, and what does that look like? Because I keep thinking of like experiments when I was in high school, like little lab setups, and we would just grow cultures in a petri dish, and then we would just rinse them out with bleach and dump them down the sink. Or
Right.
is that what happens in an actual IVF clinic? Is there a procedure for embryo destruction, or is it really
Every
the
lab
Wild West there?
every lab probably has a different protocol in regards to that. Some would probably use some toxic material to ensure that the embryos died. In the one scenario that I had in my laboratory, essentially, and I was forced to do this, by the way. I mean, I wasn't tied up and a gun held to my head, but my job was certainly at risk. It's not something I'm proud of. It's something that impacted my life in a profound way. They were left in culture, and we only have the capacity to culture those embryos to a certain stage. So at that stage that they were no longer being supported, they died.
What would that be equivalent to in an actual woman's like normal pregnancy?
The stage at which it needed to be implanted into the uterus.
So how many
Yeah, so
days or what would that be?
Like 9 days. It was 9 days old.
right, but the embryo typically implants. So this little one, like we said, travels through the tube during the first days of his or her life, right? And it rapidly growing, dividing, forming that inner cell mass and that outer ring of cells, hatching out, becoming ready to get into that uterine cavity, which occurs roughly around day 4, day 5, typically, and then right on day 5, day 6 of that embryo's life. That embryo is known as a blastocyst. It's just a fancy term saying that that's a mature embryo. And it's an amazing process, to be honest with you, because there are certain, I always think of it like this true window of implantation. Literally, there is in the uterine lining, the endometrium, there are these penopods that come, it's like they're beckoning to that embryo, and the embryo then gets taken up into the wall of the uterus and then continues that process of growth. But part of that process requires that implantation to occur because embryo has to get connected to mother's blood supply because that's what provides nutrition.
When they do pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, they're looking to see whether the cells of the embryo are genetically normal. And a common developmental issue with an embryo is aneuploidy, meaning it doesn't have the normal number of chromosomes. And so if they biopsy the embryo and they found it to have aneuploidy, they would immediately push that embryo away and say that's not a viable embryo, we're not going to transfer it, most likely it'll be discarded. But now they're finding that during the early embryo development, the placenta itself does not require normal genetic makeup. Now, it can function with some of the cells being aneuploid. And that's very common, actually, for the placenta to have aneuploid cells. So they're finding that it's quite possible that they're discarding embryos that were probably perfectly capable of developing.
Yeah. I think it just goes to show how much more intelligent even the smallest forms of life are, and I think we discredit them immensely because, I mean, it's exactly that. We take one look at them, we judge them just on based off the little knowledge that we know. I mean, even as you guys having all this knowledge, knowing every little step, but clearly they keep astounding us, really.
That's exactly right. And I think that brings up the point that we are discussing right now, which is fine, we can have knowledge, but this is not the same as any other part of medicine because what we are dealing with and discussing are human beings.
Human life.
Once we start commodifying children at any stage in their life, starting at the embryonic stage, because clearly scientifically that is where life begins, it is a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
I have a question about viability. I'm a disabled woman. I'm almost totally blind. And I've noticed a lot of the times that doctors, OBGYNs, will conflate a disability or a genetic disorder with someone not being viable. So when you say that an embryo was determined not viable, does that include the ones who would likely have disability, or is it only the ones who are definitely, no question, you think are going to die? Is that the ones that are already dead? What do you mean when you say viability?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I would prefer to say, obviously some embryos are less healthy than other embryos. I would say the field in general, because they do this artificial selection of human life, that they would view it like you're expressing it. If an embryo, say, is a carrier of a genetic disease, they would consider that one not worthy to be implanted. It's a eugenics, essentially, and it's wrong.
So I lost my vision when I was 19. My condition is not genetic, but I've always kind of wondered, like, that IVF process that I went through, if somehow this condition that I now have would have been detectable in those testings, like, would the doctor have told my parents that I wasn't viable, would I have been allowed to even be implanted? Did you guys ever have to discard embryos just on the basis of disability? And was that something that parents were fully informed about or in charge of?
So our laboratory, we did not do pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, but it is routinely done in IVF facilities, and it's done specifically for that reason, to screen out genetic disease, but also in some cases to choose the eye color of the child, choose the sex of the child. And I share your concern for that because I was actually born with bilateral club foot. My father told me when he first saw me that I would never walk. In that case, and if I was born in some societies, I wouldn't have gotten the care that I'd gotten and subsequently be able to walk. So I would have been a discard as well.
It's eugenics, it is, ultimately. But it's so subtle because it's conflated. I mean, it is true that unfortunately those embryos with abnormal chromosomes, if they are indeed normal, not just screened as abnormal, that those embryos have a higher chance, unfortunately, of resulting as a miscarriage, okay, or as that woman not even becoming pregnant. And so that's the way that it's looked at. That's the way that I looked at it, certainly. It's become now not just screening for 46XX or 46XY, but as I mentioned, polygenic embryo scores. What that means is now, because they've done these, it's called genome-wide studies. It's a fancy way of saying it, looking at all of human chromosomes, and they can try to assess and give grades and ratings for different conditions like diabetes, like high blood pressure, like psychiatric conditions, or even eye color, intelligence, height. There are literally companies in the United States today that are offering this, and it is horrifying how short of a time it's been to make this so much more pronounced and overtly just, again, eugenics.
Chelsea or Tyler, do you ever feel any sense of emotion or, I mean, I've heard the term used, survivor's guilt.
Yeah, and that's the part why I get emotional when I talk about it. I mean, that is definitely what it is because I've had such a beautiful life. I mean, so blessed, really. The things I've experienced, it just hurts to know that they never will. You know, they'll never experience love. They'll never experience things as basic as getting butterflies on your first date, having your first kiss, holding your child. And it gives me emotional time. I'm sorry, I'm really trying to keep it together. Because I just think, you know why me? I was this close. I was this close not having any of that. I was this close to not meeting my wonderful husband, having my kids. And that's the reality for the rest of them. And it's just, I feel like it's not fair. I know that's not my fault. So I wouldn't say so much that I sit here and I beat myself up about it like it's my fault. But I definitely do feel that sense of it's not fair that I have and they don't.
I get angry that my life, my survival of getting to leave the IVF clinic was random. I was the second out of 4 IVF rounds for my parents, and if I had been in that 4th round, I wouldn't have had a chance at all. I would have been discarded with the others, and that makes me really upset. I don't get very angry with people who are pro-abortion because I don't think that they care about this issue because they'll be okay with a 9-month fetus being killed. So I don't really have much expectation for them to be very concerned about an embryo. But when I run into other pro-lifers who, for some reason, think that because I was made in a dish instead of my mom, that I don't matter. I've had a woman say to me at a speaking event I was doing, yeah, Chelsea, you have an amazing story, but don't talk about IVF. because most people just think those babies are too small to count. And I don't know how to not take that personally, because what she's saying is that I was once too small to count, and as if children that are conceived the natural way are somehow better than me. I get really angry because it's the same thing. It's the same embryo, whether you're in a dish or whether you're traveling through a fallopian tube. It's the same biologically, and I don't understand why they don't see that. And it makes me feel like they think I'm some kind of freak or an alien or like just a science experiment. And I get so mad because I don't understand why some babies are worth saving to them, but others, like me, like my siblings, like Tyler, aren't. It's gross. And I just don't know how to communicate to them that my life matters, my siblings' life, it mattered. These babies matter. I feel like I have to get a Dr. Seuss book out to explain it to them. We can all read Horton Hears a Who together so they can understand that the size of a human, the disability of a human, it's arbitrary. It's still a human, which means it's a person, which means they matter. And I do think that I feel like I have to speak for them because they can't speak for themselves. My siblings are dead. They're not coming back. And if I don't say something, who's going to? It shouldn't just be a burden that my family has to deal with alone. It's something that needs to be advocated against. And I feel like so many people walk through those doors and they have no idea what happens in an IVF clinic. And for most of them, it's just, they don't want to hear it. Because then we start to have conversations like this and it becomes too painful to talk about. And then I get a little email about my next speaking event. Chelsea, we'd love to have you, but don't mention those babies.
No, but Chelsea, I mean, truly, you are a voice for the voiceless because as I think I alluded to earlier, the one person that's desired so much and wanted, but not really considered is the child or any of those embryos. And like I said, I did not. There needs to be someone, yes, advocating for this. People have been blinded to what is a human and, again, the dignity and value of each of us.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to add on that. I think it's, like you said, I think it's no longer so much even an argument about is human life valuable? It's when is human life valuable at what stage? Because I feel like even, like she was saying, even within the pro-life community, you know, I mean, we fight so hard for these lives, but then when you get pushback about IVF, then it goes right back to the argument that we have with a lot of pro-choicers about, well, it's in this stage, and instead of just human life is human life, it's at, oh, well, what stage does human life become valuable? Instead of human life is valuable because it is human life. It does not matter at what stage of development it is in. And so, yeah, I completely agree.
I was wondering about the health concerns that could happen to a child conceived through IVF. Is that even in the research yet? Because if it only started in the 80s, we kind of are guinea pigs, aren't we?
There's actually a large body of evidence now in the literature that demonstrates that there's increased probability of perinatal effects, complications to the pregnancy, but I'll focus on the children. Much of the original work was because of the transfer of multiple embryos that resulted in multiple pregnancies. The field has largely corrected that, but there's still an increased rate, even with singleton pregnancies, so pregnancies that only one embryo had implanted. These congenital defects most often influence or impact the craniofacial area, but they can also impact the other musculoskeletal, the cardiovascular, all the other systems as well. There's an increased rate. It doesn't mean that everybody will have that. It just means that there's an increased probability of that. That could become, there's three possible reasons. One is the couple themselves have underlying health issues and you haven't corrected those before they conceived. Number two is the high levels of hormones that the woman is experiencing when she's being super ovulated. That can also have an impact then on the subsequent children. And number three is it's the procedures themselves. It's the embryo culture, it's the manipulation, not just these congenital abnormalities, but quite possibly epigenetic changes. There's changes to how genes are expressed that can affect the offspring later in life. There may be increased likelihood that there will be health issues in the children because of these epigenetic changes that have occurred. Yes, there's a large body of evidence now. I don't know why it's not communicated more.
My mom has had an immense amount of health issues ever since she went through IVF. I mean, immense, to the point where at one point we did think we were going to lose her. So what is the health, effects? I mean, they're getting all those fake hormones pumped into them, beforehand. What does that do to them?
Similarly, there is evidence that for the mothers, there are increased risks, and that occurs even in the short term, certainly during the course of the stimulation cycle, because there are hormonal effects, and those can be any emotion. Those could be so mood issues. That could be physical. There's every organ system, every symptom, women have felt it. It's a very grueling process, let alone having to inject yourself with multiple medications on a nightly basis and then undergo all of these procedures, right? And so that short-term risk is present. There's also risks during the pregnancy that may increase, and that includes conditions such as an increased risk of high blood pressure in pregnancy, which can actually, in some cases, become very dangerous. It includes an increased risk of diabetes, so high sugars, which can not only impact that woman, but can impact baby, because baby's experiencing those higher sugars too, and it impacts blood vessels. It can include issues with the placenta, and so there's a 5-fold increased risk of problems with the placenta not even being able to separate off at time of delivery, and that can cause very dangerous bleeding and potentially even leading to the removal of the uterus.
Oh my gosh.
Or worse. And then finally, there are some studies showing that women who have done IVF, who are pregnant because of IVF, have an increased risk of ICU stays, so intensive care unit. So these are women who are the sickest in the hospital because of varying conditions, because of hemorrhage, for example, or some of the other ones I mentioned, that at least is doubled in these women who are undergoing IVF. For long-term risk, the data isn't as clear. It's hard to piece apart what is from, like you said, the underlying health conditions that might be contributing to the fertility issues versus what they've undergone.
Right.
But at the same time, of course, there's a concern, and there's a lot of active research trying to look and see whether there is an increased risk because of the IVF with certain hormone-responsive cancers. We know that, unfortunately, women with infertility do have an increased risk for this, but trying to determine how much of that might be due to what they've done is still being very much looked at. And then estrogen, as one of the hormones, can worsen GYN conditions like endometriosis, like uterine fibroids, already common diseases that many women, it's very painful and that they suffer with. So yes, unfortunately, there are increased risks.
With everything that's been shared, Tara, I'm curious to know what each of you think about this. Do you think that IVF should still be practiced?
I think that a lot of parents, especially before IVF became about designer babies, it started out as just women who were struggling with infertility. Like, my mom's infertility issues were so bad that when she was 18, her doctor threw their hands up in the air and told her to have a hysterectomy because there was never going to be any hope for her. I understand that a lot of couples come to IVF really wanting a child, but I think that I love how Stephanie Grape Connors puts it, like IVF makes an idol of the children that it sacrifices. And as parents, it's our job, even before we get married, to make decisions that are going to be best for our children. It starts with, how am I going to take care of myself? What person am I going to be? Who am I going to date? Who am I going to marry? How are we going to prepare for children? How are we going to make sure that we're the best parents that we can possibly be? And IVF completely flips it on its head and says, what can I get as the parent? Even when you are trying to go into it, thinking of the kids first, there are so many risks that parents just don't anticipate. What happens, like with my parents, when you're told, hey, I know you have more embryos that you wanted to implant, but you really need to stop for your own health. What are you supposed to do? Where are those embryos supposed to go? They're supposed to be able to implant in their mother's uterus. That's the home that is destined for them. And now that home is not available. Like, what if the mom has an accident and has to have a hysterectomy after a car accident? Like, there's so many things that can go wrong. What if the parents die? And I have 2 children outside of the womb right now. I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and I've drawn up legal documents that they will be taken care of if something happens to me and my husband. There is a place they're going to go. There's money that's going to pay for what they need. They will be protected. But where are those protections for the embryos if something happens to even the most well-meaning parents? And I just think that there's so much risk in it. I struggle to find easy, clean, simple scenarios in which just a infertile couple suddenly now has a child. It gets so messy so fast. I think people really need to get more educated about it so they can understand what they're walking into. It's not a good thing to be walking into.
Infertility is usually just a symptom of something much bigger, but we're not looking at that. The fertility industry doesn't care about women. They don't, even though I know some of the doctors do, they want to help those parents. They don't care about why you're having infertility. And I know some people it's just impossible, but a lot of women it is deficiencies. It is a sickness they don't know about, but we don't even check, right? We just jump to, if you want a baby, this is what you've got to do. No ifs, ands, or buts. In the society that we're in, where life is not valued and frankly we're not caring about the mother or the child, no, I don't think IVF should be practiced. With all sympathy to the parents struggling with infertility.
There are multiple significant issues, and I don't believe it should be done. And I believe that from a moral standpoint. I believe that from an ethical standpoint, because again, of all the reasons I just said, that there is no way of, like you said, it's Sophie's choice, but in the 21st century, right? You cannot be the ones deciding on a human's life. So from an ethical perspective, I think that is not right, nor is a lot of the technologies that are being employed despite not being fully vetted. And we're going down that rabbit hole even more, as I mentioned earlier. I believe that it's not right because there is an increased risk of complications and issues both for mother and child in those people undergoing IVF and doing IVF. And I believe it's not right because exactly what you said, there are alternatives that are available, but unfortunately all the resources, all of the counseling, everything is directed towards this. And so many of the options that can not only hopefully identify, address, and heal that root cause of infertility, but also help the life of that mother and her child, because obviously, as you said, Chelsea, as mothers, we want to prepare our bodies for our pregnancy, to just do our best by our children. And doing so we have to be healthy. And so those things are unfortunately being ignored right now. And again, it's unfortunate that that's what most people, that's all they know. And I don't fault anyone, again, who's undergone it. I think that there's this lack of awareness. The most important decisions are being swept under the rug because people aren't comfortable about them. You don't want to think about them, and we frankly don't know about them because we're not omniscient. We're not God.
Yeah.
So I also agree that IVF should not be performed.
There are some forms of infertility that we don't have the ability to solve any other way other than IVF right now, but we haven't put the effort into it. And so more resources need to go to restorative methods to treat the underlying reasons for infertility. If we can do more education like this to the general public so they understand you don't want to do IVF for the reasons we're discussing here today. And there are other alternatives, and at the very least we should try exhaust those other ways of treating infertility. And doctors aren't being trained in restorative methods. Let's try to build a more perfect world where people don't need IVF.
Thank you all so much for being willing to come and share your stories and have this very powerful conversation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.